My name is Claire Bennett. I am 32 years old. After 9 years of marriage, my husband walked out the front door with a single suitcase and never came back. He didn't leave for just anyone. He left for the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in our state, a woman named Victoria Caldwell, whose father owned 3 hotel chains and a real estate empire that stretched across the entire East Coast. In one afternoon, everything I had spent nearly a decade building simply disappeared. The house was in my husband's name. The joint savings account had been quietly drained over the months before he left. And by the time I figured out what had happened, there was almost nothing left for me to fight with. I want to be honest with you right now. I am not telling you this story because I want your pity. I am telling you this because what happened next, the job I took out of desperation, the man I was hired to care for, and what I discovered on my very first morning inside that house changed the entire direction of my life, and I never saw any of it coming. But before I get to that, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to HeartPath Stories. And drop a comment letting me know which state or country you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Now let me tell you what really happened. My daughter, Lily, was 8 years old when her father left. She had just started 3rd grade. She still believed her daddy was on a long work trip. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth yet. While she was at school each day, I sat at the kitchen table of my mother's spare bedroom because that's where we had moved, and I stared at job listings on my laptop, trying not to fall apart. My mother lived 40 minutes from Lily's school, so every morning I drove Lily in, dropped her off, drove back, job searched until pickup time, then started the whole cycle again. My mother watched Lily on the evenings I had interviews. I want you to know that detail because it matters later in this story. The child support situation was a disaster from the start. My husband, I'll call him Daniel, had quit his marketing job 2 months before leaving me and told the court he had no current income. His lawyer was better than mine. The temporary order gave me almost nothing. So I was surviving on what little freelance design work I could find online and whatever my mother could quietly slip into my coat pocket without making me feel worse than I already did. 3 months after the separation, I saw a posting on a local job board that stopped me cold. It read, "Live-in household manager needed. Private estate, Westbrook County. Competitive salary. Candidate must be organized, calm under pressure, and available immediately. Housing and meals provided." It was the phrase "housing and meals provided" that made my heart jump. That meant I could save almost everything I earned. That meant Lily's school fees would stop being a nightmare. That meant I could actually breathe. I called the number listed. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was smooth and professional, and she introduced herself as the personal assistant to the Caldwell family. She explained that the position was to serve as full-time household manager for an elderly gentleman who had recently returned home after a brief hospitalization. She mentioned that he could be challenging to work with at times and that patience was essential. When I asked what kind of challenging, she paused before saying he sometimes had difficulty with his moods and that previous staff had found the environment stressful. I told her I was interested anyway. She scheduled me for an interview the following Tuesday. I want to pause here and tell you something important. When she said the Caldwell family, I didn't connect it at first. Caldwell is not an unusual name. There are probably a dozen Caldwell families in our county alone. So I drove to the interview without a single alarm going off in my head. The estate was located at the end of a long private road lined with oak trees so tall they formed a canopy overhead. When the house came into view, I actually slowed the car down because I needed a moment to take it in. It was enormous, a white colonial with black shutters, at least 6 or 7 bedrooms from what I could count from the outside, with a circular driveway and a fountain in the center that wasn't running. A gardener was trimming hedges near the left side of the entrance. Everything about the property looked expensive, controlled, and cold. A woman met me at the door. She was in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a blazer even though it was a casual Tuesday afternoon. She introduced herself as the personal assistant I had spoken to on the phone. Her name was Janet. She led me into a formal sitting room off the main entry and offered me water, which I accepted, and then she walked me through the role in precise, almost rehearsed detail. The gentleman I would be managing the household for was named Edward Caldwell. He was 71 years old. He had built the family's business empire over 40 years. He had suffered a health episode 6 weeks prior, and his doctors had recommended he not be left alone. His family, Janet explained carefully, was very invested in his well-being. I would be responsible for coordinating the household staff, managing his daily schedule, ensuring his medications were administered on time, accompanying him to appointments, and being generally present and available throughout the day. I would have my own room on the second floor, and weekends would include alternating days off. I accepted the position before I even left the driveway. When I got home that evening and told my mother, she hugged me for a long time. We arranged for Lily to stay with her during the week, and I would come back every Friday evening and stay through Sunday. It wasn't perfect. It hurt my heart to be away from my daughter during the school week. But my mother lived 10 minutes from Lily's school. She adored her granddaughter, and Lily already called that guest bedroom her adventure room. It was the best option I had. And I made sure Lily understood that Mommy was working very hard so that one day very soon we would have our own home again. She seemed to accept that the way 8-year-olds sometimes do with a trust that adults spend years trying to earn back once they've lost it. I started on a Monday. Janet showed me around the estate that first morning. The kitchen, the laundry room, the medical schedule binder, the staff communication system, the emergency contacts. Everything was organized to a degree that suggested someone very particular had set it all up. At the end of the tour, Janet led me down a wide hallway toward the back of the house and knocked twice on a heavy wooden door before opening it. The room inside was large and filled with natural light. Bookshelves covered 2 full walls. A desk near the window was stacked with papers and folders. And in an armchair near the window sat an elderly man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, wearing a cardigan and reading glasses that he lowered slowly as I entered. He looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, in a voice much steadier than I expected, that he supposed I was the new one. I introduced myself. I told him my name and said I was glad to meet him. He studied me for another few seconds, then returned to his book without another word. Janet whispered that this was actually a warm welcome by his standards. The first week was exactly as advertised. Edward Caldwell was not an easy man. He had opinions about everything: the temperature of his tea, the way the mail was sorted, which chair I sat in during our afternoon check-ins. He had little patience for what he called hovering. He didn't want to be coddled. He didn't want to be spoken to like he was fragile. He wanted things done correctly and on time, and he wanted to be left alone in between. I adapted quickly because, honestly, after 9 years of walking on eggshells in my own marriage, a grumpy man with clear preferences felt almost manageable. By Wednesday of my second week, something shifted. I had brought him his afternoon tea at exactly the right temperature and placed it on the correct coaster without being reminded, and when I turned to leave, he said, without looking up from his book, that I had good instincts. That was all. But from Edward Caldwell, that felt like a standing ovation. It was on a Thursday evening of that same week that everything changed. The household staff had finished for the day. I had completed my evening check-in with Edward, confirmed his evening medications were laid out properly, and was walking back toward the staircase when I heard the front door open. It wasn't unusual for the family to visit. Janet had mentioned that his daughter came by regularly. I didn't think anything of it. And then I heard the laugh. It was a specific laugh. A sound I had heard for 9 years across a dining table, through walls, in the dark. My feet stopped moving before my brain had finished processing what I was hearing. I stood completely still in the hallway as footsteps came closer. He came around the corner first. Daniel. My husband. Looking comfortable and relaxed in a way I had never quite seen him look in our home. And on his arm, laughing at something he had just said, was a woman I recognized from photographs my mutual friends had quietly stopped tagging me in. Victoria Caldwell, the daughter of the man I had just spent 2 weeks learning to care for. Daniel saw me at the exact moment I saw him. His expression shifted through about 4 different emotions in under 2 seconds. Then a slow, deliberate smile settled across his face. "Claire," he said, like he was greeting an old acquaintance. like we hadn't shared a bed and a life and a daughter for nearly a decade. Victoria looked between us. "You two know each other?" "We used to be married," Daniel said pleasantly. Then he looked back at me with that smile still in place and said it was funny how things worked out, wasn't it? I didn't answer. My hands were completely still at my sides. Every rational part of my brain was telling me to say something professional and neutral and walk away. But another part of me, the part that had cried in my mother's guest bathroom for 3 months, was fighting very hard to keep my face composed. Victoria stepped slightly in front of Daniel. Her tone when she spoke to me was not unkind exactly, but it carried the specific weight of someone who has never once in their life worried about where rent would come from. She said she hoped I was settling in well and that she expected the household to run smoothly going forward. Then she turned back to Daniel and gestured toward the sitting room, and just like that, I became invisible. I stood in that hallway for another few seconds after they disappeared. Then I walked upstairs, closed the door to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and just breathed. I thought about Lily's face when I had dropped her off at school that morning. Her little backpack. The way she had waved at me from the doorway. I was not going to fall apart. I was not going to quit. My daughter needed this job, and so I was going to do it. What I didn't know yet was that I had walked into something far more serious than a painful coincidence. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel appeared at the estate more and more frequently. Every time he passed me in a hallway or saw me near the kitchen, he made sure to say something. Once he told a guest visiting Victoria, loudly enough for me to hear from across the room, that I used to be his wife and that life certainly had a sense of humor. The guest looked at me with an expression that sat somewhere between confusion and pity. Daniel looked satisfied. I said nothing and continued carrying the tray I was holding to the table. Victoria, for her part, barely seemed to notice me at all. She visited her father occasionally, but always briefly, and she spent more time on her phone during those visits than actually speaking with him. I noticed that Edward became quieter after her visits. Not agitated the way he sometimes got. Just quieter. Like something had deflated slightly. Then one afternoon, about 3 weeks into my time there, a medical team arrived. 2 men and a woman, all in professional clothing, carrying bags. Janet let them in and led them to Edward's room. I wasn't told what the visit was for. When they left about 45 minutes later, I went in to bring Edward his late afternoon tea. He was sitting by the window, but something was different. His hands were resting flat on his knees, and his eyes had a glazed, distant quality I hadn't seen before. When I set the tea down, he looked up at me, and for a second I wasn't sure he recognized me. Then his expression cleared slightly. But not all the way. Over the next several days, he got worse. Not dramatically not throwing things or shouting, but the sharpness was gone. The man who had corrected the temperature of his tea to within 1 degree of his preference now let it go cold without touching it. He forgot the names of his longtime staff members. He repeated questions he had already asked. I flagged it with Janet, who told me that his doctors were monitoring the situation and that I should continue following the medication schedule as outlined. I followed it exactly. And still, he declined. One evening, I was passing the study on my way to the kitchen when I heard voices. The door was open a few inches. I wasn't trying to listen. But I heard Victoria's voice and then Daniel's, and something in the tone made me slow down without deciding to. Victoria was speaking quietly. She said that the dosage adjustment was already showing results and that his attorney had confirmed the timeline. Daniel asked how long it would take before he was no longer able to make legal decisions for himself. Victoria said her own lawyer believed they were looking at 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how quickly the documentation moved through the court. I did not move. I stood absolutely still in that hallway, and I made myself keep breathing slowly. Then Daniel said something that turned my stomach completely cold. He said that once Edward was declared incompetent, the estate transfer would be straightforward. And Victoria said in the same calm, practical tone someone might use to discuss a grocery list that her father had never updated his will after her brother was cut out, which meant that if he became legally incompetent before doing so, everything defaulted to her. All of it. I walked back to my room. I sat down. I thought about what I had just heard for a very long time. The next morning, I went in to bring Edward his breakfast, and I made sure we were completely alone before I sat down across from him. I waited until he looked at me with one of his clearer moments, because they still came brief windows during the day when his eyes sharpened again and he seemed like himself. When that window came, I leaned forward and spoke very quietly. I told him I needed him to listen to me carefully. I told him what I had heard the night before, word for word. I told him about the dosage adjustment. I told him about the timeline. I told him about the attorney. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, quietly and without any drama, that he had wondered. He said his mind had been slipping in a way that felt different from normal aging. He said it felt chemical. He had thought he was imagining it. He wasn't imagining it. I told him I wanted to help him. I told him I wasn't sure yet what the right steps were, but that I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't heard what I'd heard. He looked at me for a long moment and then said something that I think about often. He said that his daughter had always wanted his success more than she had ever wanted his company, and that he supposed he had known that for years and had simply chosen not to look at it directly. Then he straightened up in his chair and asked me what I thought we should do. We were careful. We had to be. I continued running the household exactly as I always had, following every visible protocol, giving no indication that anything had changed. But I quietly began documenting. Times when the medical team visited. Notes on Edward's condition before and after those visits. Observations about which medications were administered by the regular nursing assistant versus the team that came from outside. I also reached out, through a personal contact rather than anything connected to the estate, to a physician I trusted. I described the pattern of symptoms without giving names. She told me what I already suspected, that the progression I was describing was not typical of natural cognitive decline. It was too fast, too specific, and too tied to external medical interventions. It took 2 months of patience that I did not always feel. 2 months of watching Daniel walk through that house like he owned it already. 2 months of overhearing Victoria make decisions about furniture and renovations as though Edward was already gone. 2 months of Edward performing confusion he no longer fully felt, for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. Because that was the plan we had agreed on. Edward would not let on that he was improving. When Victoria visited, he was vacant and confused and sometimes agitated. He played it carefully, not so dramatically that it seemed theatrical, just consistently diminished in the way she clearly expected him to be. She left those visits satisfied every time. Meanwhile, Edward had quietly made contact with his personal attorney, not the one Victoria's team had been working with, but his original attorney, a man named Gerald Marsh who had handled Edward's affairs for 30 years. I helped arrange those conversations through channels that didn't go through the main household system. Edward also made contact with his son, Marcus, who had been cut off from the family years ago after a disagreement with Victoria that Edward had always privately regretted. Marcus flew in from Portland. The first meeting between him and his father in 4 years happened in this very house, in Edward's room, on a Tuesday morning when Victoria was in the city for a lunch meeting. I waited outside during that conversation. When Marcus came out, his eyes were red. He shook my hand and said simply that his father had told him everything and that he was grateful. That was all, but it was enough. 3 weeks later, Victoria called a formal family meeting at the estate. She had invited Edward's attorney, her version of his attorney, the one her team had been cultivating along with 2 doctors who had been part of the outside medical team. Daniel was there. A financial advisor was there. Everything about the setup communicated that this was a formality. A closing of a door that everyone in the room had assumed was already open. Victoria spoke first, standing at the head of the long table in the dining room while Edward sat in his wheelchair at the opposite end. She described his decline in clinical, sorrowful language, the confusion, the volatility, the inability to manage even basic decisions. She said it with an expression of tremendous reluctance, as though this was costing her something. Daniel sat beside her with his hands folded on the table. He glanced once in my direction and gave me the smallest, most dismissive smile I had ever seen on a human face. Then Victoria turned to the attorney and said she believed it was time to move forward with the competency determination. Edward cleared his throat. Victoria paused. He sat up slowly in the wheelchair. And when he spoke, his voice was completely level and completely clear. He said he appreciated everyone coming. Then he said he had a few things he needed to say before anyone moved forward with anything. Victoria's expression flickered. Just for a second. Edward looked directly at his daughter and told her that he knew about the medication adjustments. He told her he knew about the attorney timeline. He told her he knew that she and Daniel had been planning this for months and that they had believed he was too far gone to understand what was happening around him. Then he said, calmly, that they had been wrong. The two outside doctors looked at each other. The financial advisor shifted in his chair. Daniel's face had gone completely still. Victoria started to speak, and Edward held up one hand. Just one hand, quietly, and she stopped. Gerald Marsh, seated at the far end of the table, opened his briefcase and began placing documents on the table. He explained that he had been working with Edward privately for the past several weeks. He explained that new medical evaluations conducted by an independent team with no connection to the estate had found no evidence of organic cognitive decline consistent with the diagnosis Edward had been given. He explained that there was documented evidence suggesting the medications prescribed by the outside team had been causing the observed symptoms rather than treating them. He then explained that Edward had, in full legal competency and in the presence of two witnesses and a notary, updated his estate documents 3 weeks ago. Victoria stood up. Her voice, when it came out, had lost all of its composure. She said this was not possible. She said her father was not capable of making those decisions. She said it had to be challenged. Daniel reached for her arm, and she pulled away from him. Gerald continued without raising his voice. He noted that recordings existed of conversations held on the estate property that were relevant to questions of intent, and that those recordings had already been provided to the appropriate parties. Two people I had not recognized when they first entered the room seated near the door, quiet the entire time, stood up and identified themselves as investigators. Within 10 minutes, Victoria and Daniel had been escorted from the dining room. I stood near the wall and watched Daniel walk past me. He didn't look at me this time. The room was very quiet after they left. Edward looked across the long table toward Marcus, who was seated near the window. Something passed between them without words. Then Edward looked over at me. His blue eyes were steady and clear in a way they hadn't been when I first met him. He said that he had something to tell the room, and he asked Gerald to proceed. Gerald explained that Edward's revised estate documents reflected several significant changes. He mentioned Marcus. He mentioned several long-serving members of the household staff, and then he said my name. He said that Edward had designated a portion of his estate and a substantial financial provision to Claire Bennett in recognition of her integrity, her courage, and what Edward believed to be an act of genuine human decency in a situation where the easier choice would have been to look away. I had not been expecting that. I want to be honest with you. In all the planning, in all the quiet conversations, Edward had never mentioned that part to me. I think he knew I would have objected. I stood near that wall, and I did not trust myself to say anything for a moment. And then Edward said, quietly, that I had come into his home as a stranger just trying to survive another week, and that I had stayed as something closer to family. He said he was grateful that there were still people like me in the world. I thought about Lily. I thought about my mother's spare bedroom. I thought about the night I had sat at that kitchen table and stared at a laptop screen willing something to change. I thought about Daniel's face in this room, and the moment, weeks ago, when he had stood in this same house and told me I was basically a servant and expected that to be the last word on who I was. It wasn't the last word. I drove to my mother's house that Friday evening, the same as I had every Friday for the past 3 months. Lily was waiting at the window the way she always was. When I opened the door, she ran at me with the full body commitment that only 8-year-olds can manage, and I picked her up and held on. My mother made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed, and I told her everything. She held my hand across the table and didn't say very much. When I finished, she just said that she had always believed things would turn around. She had believed it even on the nights when I hadn't been able to. Daniel's legal situation, along with Victoria's, moved through the courts over the following months. I won't pretend it was quick or simple. These things never are. But the evidence was clear, and the outcome, when it finally came, reflected that. The child support order was also revisited, this time with a judge who had a more complete picture of Daniel's actual financial circumstances. Lily's school fees stopped being something I lost sleep over. Edward recovered fully. Or as fully as a 71-year-old man who has been through what he had been through can recover. He and Marcus had dinner together twice a week. He started reading again in the mornings, the real reading philosophy, history, the long complicated books that had been stacked on his shelves gathering dust during the months when his mind had been clouded. The first time I walked into his room and saw him marking passages with a pencil again, I had to take a moment in the hallway before going back in. I stayed on at the estate for several more months after everything that happened, partly because I genuinely wanted to make sure Edward was settled, and partly because I wasn't ready to make any large decisions quickly. When I eventually left, it was on good terms and with enough stability that the decisions I made next were made from a place of choice rather than desperation. That was a feeling I had not had in a very long time. I did not take it for granted for a single day. I want to leave you with the thing I think about most when I look back on all of it. When I took that job, I was not looking to be a hero. I was looking to pay rent and keep my daughter in school. I was running on almost empty. I made the choice to tell Edward what I had heard rather than look the other way, wasn't made from a position of courage. It was made from the simple sense that I could not live with myself if I stayed quiet. That was all. Nothing more heroic than that. But sometimes that's all it takes. Sometimes doing the right thing when it would be far easier not to is enough to change everything. Not just for you, but for the people who are counting on anyone to finally choose them. And if you are in a season right now where it feels like you are carrying too much and not getting enough back, I want you to hear this directly. Your integrity is not invisible, even when it feels that way. The right people will see it. Keep going. Thank you for being here. If this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who needs it today, and I will see you in the next one.